Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of William Taft, and the focus is Judge Taft. The year is 1889, and Taft is a judge already of the Ohio Superior Court. He's only 32 years old. He's happy as a clam. This is the career path he was hoping for. And there was a change in administrations in Washington. Democrats are out, Republicans back in, Benjamin Harrison's the president, and there's an opening on the Supreme Court, Taft's dream job. His friends are pushing him, you should go for this job, you should go for this job. And he said, look, too inexperienced. I'm not ready for this. And he said, my chances of going to the moon and of donning a silk gown at the hands of President Harrison are about equal. Well, Harrison agreed, but Harrison did have a job for him, and it was at the Supreme Court, not as a judge, but as an advocate on behalf of the government. The position of Solicitor General of the United States had only been around for about 20 years. It started under the Ulysses Grant administration, and the job of the Solicitor General was to argue cases on behalf of the government with the Supreme Court. You would also prepare legal briefs for the president, for the cabinet, work directly for the Attorney General, and Harrison offered this job to Taft. Now, initially, he was reluctant. He wanted to be a judge. He was already a judge. He liked being on the bench. And besides, the federal law was something that was kind of new to him. He didn't have a lot of experience in it, and he was going to be trying cases based on that law in front of the Supreme Court. This is a pretty big leap. He was cautious. There was one person who was not cautious, and that was his wife, Nellie. This was exactly the kind of job she wanted, executive branch, right in the thick of things, an opportunity to make connections. Look, she wanted him to be president of the United States. A judge was a dead-end position. This was what she wanted. He had to take it, and sure enough, he did. Nellie set up shop in the small home on DuPont Circle, while Taft initially was quite discouraged by his job. Look, there's a big backlog of cases, been a couple of months since anybody had been in this job. He had only one person helping him, one staff assistant, and she was sort of part-time because she had to support other people as well. And again, Taft was uncomfortable with the details of federal law. It just wasn't his specialty, at least not yet. But none of this deterred Taft. He dove right in like he always did. And in fact, he got the hang of it pretty quickly. He did pretty well in his first year in front of the Supreme Court. He won 15 out of 18 cases. Nellie was the one on cloud nine. Social circle was exactly what she wanted. The connections that her husband was making, going out with the Attorney General, Supreme Court justices, members of Congress, these intellectually stimulating conversations and the relationships, the connections that he was making, this was the path to the presidency. Well, Taft himself was a very social creature. He enjoyed all of this himself, and he made one friend in particular. His closest new friend was an up-and-coming reformer from the state of New York. He was a member of the Civil Service Commission by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt and Taft were actually very different personality-wise. Roosevelt was fiery and pugnacious and impulsive, whereas Taft was calm and deliberate, and judicial was actually a pretty good term to describe his personality. But they bonded. They really enjoyed each other's company. They walked to work together almost every day. They'd have lunch together. One thing they had in common, an uproarious laugh. You could hear them a couple of doors down when they were getting together and having a good time. Theodore Roosevelt, other than Nellie Taft, would be the biggest influence on Taft for the rest of his professional career. Mostly for the good, sometimes not for the good, and very not for the good, but that's what we'll cover in future episodes. In the meantime, the circle of life kicking in for the Taft family. They welcomed their first child in 1889. In September, Robert was born. A couple of years later, they had a daughter named Helen. 6 years after that, their third and final child, Charlie, was born. On the other end of the circle was Taft's father. Judge Alphonso Taft, who had had such a big influence on Taft's life, was ailing, heart and lung issues. He went off to California to try to get better. He wasn't. So in May of 1891, Taft went to the West Coast to say his goodbyes to his father, who was mostly out of it. But at one point, Taft said he looked up at me in the sweetest way imaginable and said to me, "Will, I love you beyond expression." Very nice and peaceful way to say goodbye to his father, again, who had such a big influence on his life. Now, Alphonso Taft would certainly be proud of his son in terms of what happened next. He would be on the move again with a little assist from the United States Congress. And there were backlogs of cases in the federal judiciary all over the place, and so Congress decided to create a new layer, the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. This meant 12 new federal judgeships. One of them, the Sixth Circuit, was based in Cincinnati, in Taft's hometown, and he wanted this job. I like judicial life, he said, and there was only one higher judicial position in the country than that in the line of promotion to the Supreme Court. he was pushing. The Ohio bar was in his favor, pushing on his behalf. Really only one person who didn't want Taft to become a federal judge, and that was his wife, Nellie. She said that if you get your heart's desire, it will put an end to all the opportunities you now have of being thrown with the bigwigs. But she was again confusing her heart's desire and his heart's desire. His heart's desire wasn't in the executive branch, it was in the judiciary. This was a lifetime appointment, and he was not going to be denied. And even later, after his presidency, Nellie Taft wrote that, "I think he enjoyed the work of the following 8 years more than any he has ever undertaken." They moved back to Cincinnati, and Taft was ready to put on those robes, a 34-year-old, a lifetime appointment, ready to go straight to work. Now, Taft as a judge was widely recognized as for his conservative views, his discipline in the courtroom, and also diligent in his reviews and his decisions. And a lot of the most challenging decisions he faced were in the area of labor and management relations. This was a period in American history where a lot of folks were leaving the farms and going to the factories. This created a sort of a new supply and demand situation where the bosses and management really had everything in their favor. They had the jobs, they had a lot of people who wanted them, so they could pay very low wages. They didn't care about working conditions, but one thing they had in their favor was the government. The federal judiciary, the executive branch, the legislatures all seemed to lean toward management when it came to these labor and management disputes. And Will Taft was pretty aligned with that. So let's talk about 3 important cases in Taft's tenure as a federal judge to give us a feel for what Taft was like in his judicial philosophy and in his decisions. The first case of note, 1893, the Toledo, Ann Arbor, and Northern Michigan Railway Company versus Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers. Now, this was a similar case to what Taft had had in the Moores decision at the state court level we talked about in the last episode. In this case, the engineers struck the Toledo line. That was fine, but they went further. In their bylaws, they had something called Rule 12, which required all the members of the union to strike other rail lines as well that were related to the Toledo. Now, in this case, Taft did not change his opinion from what he had previously. This was a sympathy strike, a secondary strike with no legitimate dispute against these other railways. For William Taft, that meant this was illegal. It was an illegal boycott. The existent enforcement of Rule 12, according to Taft, under their organic law, make the whole brotherhood a criminal conspiracy against the laws of their country. He issued an injunction against these strikes against these other entities, and he would start getting a bit of a reputation as an injunction judge as he tended to favor management. Well, the biggest strike of this era was in Chicago, the next year, 1894, against the Pullman Palace Car Company. The workers were striking over wages. They wanted to go to arbitration. Pullman said no, so they decided to strike. And the American Railway Union decided to honor that strike. Any railway anywhere in the country that used Pullman cars was subject to the strike. The rails almost immediately came to a screeching halt across 27 states. There was some violence, a lot of federal equities in this, and President Grover Cleveland and his Attorney General Richard Olney got involved. They said, look, this is an assault on interstate commerce. This is impeding the delivery of the U.S. mail. We need to stop this, and they sent in federal troops, broke up the strike. Many of the union leaders were actually arrested. Well, where does Judge Taft fit into this? He's down in Cincinnati in a different circuit. Well, Frank Phelan, who was a leader in the American Railway Union, decided to come to Cincinnati to try to gather support to get more strikers against these Pullman cars, and he set his sights on the Cincinnati Southern Railroad. Now, the Cincinnati Southern was in receivership under the Judge Taft's court, and the receiver sued. He said, look, my railroad didn't do anything to these people. This strike is illegal. There was a lot of tension in the courtroom as the strikers would come into Judge Taft's court during the entire trial. They were a little bit noisy at the time, but Taft, he was undeterred by all this. He was the same calm, judicial manner, and he came back with the same answer he'd come back with before. He actually went in great detail about the rights that unions have and their workers have to strike against their main employer with whom they had their disputes. But they couldn't go in all these secondary strikes. These were illegal boycotts. And again, according to Judge Taft, they, the workers in Cincinnati, were not dissatisfied with their service or their pay. This guy Phelan came to Cincinnati to carry out the purpose of a combination of men, and his act in inciting the employees of all Cincinnati roads to quit service was part of that combination. If the combination was unlawful, then every act in pursuance of it was unlawful. He had already issued an injunction, he issued another one, and because Phelan had actually violated the previous injunction, he found Phelan in contempt of court and threw him in jail for 6 months. This reputation as the injunction judge would continue. One more case, and this one's a little bit different. It had been about a decade since Congress had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, really the first antitrust legislation in American history. But in that 10 years, there had been actually very few cases and even fewer victories for the government. This was still a very new law, and the judges were still kind of figuring out where to draw the line when it came to antitrust. So one of these cases, this is 1898, came before Judge Taft. It was Addison Pipe and Steel Company. Now, this was a group of 6 pipe companies that had been combined, and they admitted that they had been killing each other on price in sort of cutthroat competition, so they decided that we're going to combine. But this wasn't a monopoly. It couldn't be. They only had 30% of the national pipe market, so how could that be considered monopolistic? Well, Taft disagreed. He said this was actually a classic case of antitrust, that the purpose of coming together was to reduce competition and fix prices, and it was one of the first judges to actually rule against the company in one of these antitrust cases, and his decision not only was upheld by the Supreme Court, it was unanimous. Now, Taft later in his presidency would go after these trusts in a significant way as well. This was really his first encounter where he found this particular trust to be illegal. Taft was very much by the book as a judge. He played no favorites, including his father-in-law, John Helen, came before the Taft court in a banking case and lost. He told his son-in-law, "I thought you were unfair to me," so Will Taft said, "Fine, go appeal." John Helen did. He lost again. Taft prevailed on his decision. Taft had a buddy from Yale who was having a dispute with an assistant secretary of state. Taft ruled against his buddy. He lost his job. He lost his friend, but again, this was not the kind of thing that was getting in the way of Will Taft from making the right call. Even Benjamin Harrison, his benefactor, he had made him Solicitor General. He had put him on this bench in the federal court. Well, now, former President Harrison is now a lawyer again. He's trying cases, and he has a case before the Taft court, and he asked for a delay. He needed more time to prepare, and William Taft, Judge Taft, said, "No, you have enough time. Former president or not, benefactor or not, let's get on with this case." In 1899, life is good for federal Judge William Taft. He's living his dream. He's still young, only 42 years old. The sky's the limit. A Republican is back in the White House. William McKinley taking over. He's from Ohio. He knows Taft. Maybe the Supreme Court might come calling at some point. And sure enough, Will Taft gets a telegram from William McKinley inviting him to come to Washington. Could this be about the court? He'd have to find out. That's the story for another day. That is William Taft, Judge Taft, from the life of William Taft. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.